Hello, it's just David here with my weekly message. As you might remember, I'm just going to spend 2 or 3 weeks looking at some of the Easter appearances and thinking a bit about them. I went to a theological college just outside Oxford called Cunston, and if you want to break into it, and I assume it hasn't changed, I mean, it's now nearly 30 years since I left, but I assume the key codes are the same. It's 1053, 1053. It would be funny if they are still the same and that enables you to break in. Um, Now, you might think, well, why is that? Well, as somebody pointed out, it was the last full year of the Byzantine Empire. It was the time when the East and the West finally split, and that was known as the Great Schism in 1054, the following year. You might sort of think of the Reformation or Henry VIII as the big split in the church, but of course, globally, that was a secondary split. The fundamental split was between what we would now call sort of Roman Catholic and then Protestant Christians as we broke away, and the Eastern Orthodox churches. You might add a third group, which was the Oriental churches, but I don't want to confuse the matter. And Roman Catholic Church had its base in Rome, unsurprisingly, and the Eastern Orthodox churches had their base in Constantinople, what's now Istanbul. And they fell out over one Latin word, philoque, which means and the Son. Now, you might think that's a pretty silly thing to fall out over, but it's when you say it in the creed. So when you're in the creed talking about the Holy Spirit, he proceeds from the Father and the Son. Now, the trouble is the original text, which was written in 392, didn't have of the Son. It said he proceeds from the Father. And there'd been sort of lots of toing and froing over this, but eventually the Roman Church in the West said, well, we're going to say and the Son. And the Eastern Church said, well, you can't do that. You can't change the creed without our permission. And the Roman Church said, well, yeah, actually we can. Of course, behind that, for those of you who are interested, there's a lot of sort of theology, and also there's a lot of history. I mean, basically, just it wasn't really anything to do with those three words. I mean, basically, two major power bases was built up: Constantinople, Rome, and they were sort of barely on speaking terms for a very long time. So eventually, after that, they split. Now, of course. Constantinople, we hear less about the Orthodox churches, perhaps. I mean, they still exist, of course, the Greek, the Russian Orthodox churches. But of course, most of the area full of Orthodox Christians was taken over by sort of the Islamic conquests a little later. So that was a bit of history for you there. What's that got to do with Easter resurrection appearances? Well, let me read this to you from John's Gospel, one of the resurrection appearances in chapter 20. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit." Now, I wonder where you would place that in the sort of chronology of the Gospels, because it is a little bit of a puzzle. Because in the church's year, we have a sequence of events that goes like this. Jesus died, rose again on Easter Day. He ascended into heaven after 40 days. The disciples prayed together in the upper room. And then on the 50th day, on the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit came. And that's kind of the story we tell as a church. But it's not the whole story. It's because John gives a slightly different version of events. We get those events from Luke, because the sort of end of that story, the ascension and Pentecost, come in Acts of the Apostles. It's not in the Gospels. So so John has a slightly different version, in that he gifts the Holy Spirit to the disciples in a resurrection appearance. The phrase you've just heard there. And it's very, very different. Whereas, Pentecost seems to be quite a noisy affair, at least at the end. It isn't to begin with, interestingly, but we think of it as being quite a tumultuous affair. But I think probably because of the wind and the fire and the stuff. John's Gospel is very, very different. Jesus just meets with the 12 very quietly. It's while they're sort of in the room together, and just breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." And as you may have heard before, that word breath, the word breath and wind and spirit are all the same in Greek. So you can translate it numerous different ways. He spirited it on them and said, "Receive the holy breath." It would be equally good translation. So going back to my original point, the West was quite happy to add the words and the Son, because of that text, because where it said the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, they would say, well, look, here is the Spirit proceeding from the Son, because Jesus is giving it to his disciples. He's breathing on them. Whereas, of course, in Acts of the Apostles, it is rather different, because Jesus is off the scene. He's ascended and gone, and then the Spirit comes. So that's more like the sort of Eastern version here. The Spirit proceeds simply from the Father. There's no Son involved. But here, Jesus the Son is clearly involved in the gift of the Spirit. Perhaps one of the nice things about this is that it comes together with peace. As I say, it's a very peaceful scene. It's a very quiet scene, rather different from the Acts scene. Peace I give with you. Jesus has promised his peace to them at least two or three times in the sort of the long discourse he gives at the Last Supper, and often in the same time as he promises that the Paraclete, or what we translate as Spirit, the one who comes alongside you. And I suppose in turbulent times, that's rather a nice image, isn't it? That image of the Holy Spirit just coming very quietly, like breath, and just bringing peace for us. Of course, one of the saddest things about perhaps that division is, of course, that it didn't bring peace. It brought sort of major ructions between the East and the Western Church. One of the things we forget is that the Crusades often did more damage to Eastern Orthodox Christians than they did to do anything to rescue the Holy Land from the Muslim conquests. I mean, they tended to sort of run out of steam somewhere around sort of Constantinople and lay siege to it or something. So there's quite a lot of history between the East and the West and the Church, and perhaps we need to remember that promise of the Spirit, that promise of peace which he gives to us. So I hope in turbulent times you're able to find the gift of peace, and perhaps just, although we all celebrate Pentecost, as I say, with that rather sort of perhaps dramatic image, which is all well and good. I mean, it's joyful and it's but perhaps also sometimes we need to remember this more peaceful gift of the Spirit of Jesus to his disciples, quietly breathing upon them. Thank you.